I'm happy to welcome back to the program Amy Swearer. She's an expert on the Second Amendment as well as a legal fellow for the Heritage Foundation. Amy, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
You were on a much bigger stage recently as you testified in front of Congress about the various gun control measures that seem to be coming our way. Before we get into all the details on it, am I correct in my perception that, there's this constant sort of thing that Democrats do? It goes back to this never let a crisis go to waste. It seems like they just want to take advantage of these terrible tragedies by pushing their agenda through.
Yeah, though I will say, in this case with some of the ones that just got passed through the House, it was just a bit of timing that we had the tragedy in Boulder, I believe either the day before or within 48 hours of the hearings for those bills in the Senate. But you even saw in those hearings in the Senate, having sat through all 4.5 hours of it, it was the case even within those hearings that there was a lot of talking about Boulder, even though, one, at the time we didn't know a whole lot. It had just happened the day before. There wasn't a lot of information. And then it actually turns out that later in the day and in the days following, what we did find out was none of the bills we were talking about would have mattered in any way, shape, or form. So it was sort of this other side of, this very weird aspect of talking about a tragedy that none of these bills would have prevented. Yeah,
I think this was one of the most amazing things that happens after each one of these things, because as you point out, in this particular case, this was ongoing anyway, kind of one of their first, promised bills to push through. But typically what happens in these cases is they have an opportunity to reverse engineer the policy to the previous crime that they say is inspiring it, and they still can't find a law that would actually stop the shooting. I mean, it really is a massive failure, and I think a real sign that these laws, it's hard to legislate this out of existence.
Well, it's not only hard to legislate this out of existence, but I think part of the problem with the political rhetoric and sort of the modern American political mindset is that we, for reasons of politics, try to stick to easy sounding talking points, regardless of whether or not those talking points have anything to do with good policy, with actually addressing the problems. Because it turns out when you do the work and look at what the underlying problems are, they're much harder to address than, say, passing an easy sounding law about quote unquote assault weapons. It takes a lot more effort and a lot more nuance and a lot more just thought put into it. But unfortunately, that's not how politics works. And it really cuts off a lot of opportunities to talk about how we could actually address some of these problems.
Well, I want to get to some of those here in a second, but you point out that a lot of this goes to talking points and bumper sticker type slogans. So let me give you a couple of those, because I grew up in Connecticut. I was not a particularly we were not a big gun family. I now live in Texas, where I think it's required by law. And it's interesting, though, talking to people who are not big fans of guns, or some people who actually like the Second Amendment and like firearms generally, they constantly mention the background check thing. And that's what the Democrats seem to approach the public with all the time. Why not have universal background checks? Well, why is that a bad idea?
Well, so let's start with one of the things that I think is most important here. What is the actual law right now? Because people talk about universal background checks. They hear that and they're like, oh, my goodness, are people just all over buying guns from a vending machine without a background check? So it's already the case that most gun sales that we think of when we talk about gun sales, going to a gun store, allegedly buying guns over the internet. Whenever you buy something over the internet, you can't just have a gun shipped to your door. Whenever you buy across state lines, whether you're buying at a gun show, it doesn't matter if it is a federally licensed a federal firearms licensee who is in the business of selling guns for profit, that requires a background check. The end. The only thing that we're talking about realistically is this idea of what I would call publicly advertised private sales. So these have to be conducted in person and between residents of the same state. So things like arms list, Craigslist gun sales, where you're just trying to find a buyer you've never met before. Now, even with that, if you know or have reason to suspect that the person is prohibited, it's still a crime to sell to them. So there, it's not just this sort of blank slate to sell to whoever you want within your own state. And again, part of the reason for this is I, as an ordinary private citizen, can't just call up the FBI to run a background check on another person.
Right.
I have to go through and pay a third party to do that. So that's really what we're talking about, is this very limited aspect of where right now we don't have to have a background check conducted for, fairly legitimate reasons. And I think it's worth addressing that, at least in theory. But the problem is, when you look at universal background check bills in practice, they're not limited to just addressing that problem. They go so far overbroad to basically criminalize any temporary private low-risk transfer between people who are not prohibited. And even in some cases, it would make it more difficult to take life-saving measures. For example, to transfer your guns if you're not in a good mental state, to transfer that to a friend or a family member, without having to traipse down to a gun store. It just gets in the way of these common sense measures because it's not narrowly tailored at the real problem.
Yeah, I think, I'm of the sort of opinion that the Second Amendment has already been infringed in many, many ways. So I'm sort of at the point of, look, I don't want to give 1 inch in any direction on this one. So maybe I'm not the right person to ask. But is there an argument to be made that because we're talking about a small minority of cases that almost are never responsible for these crimes, should the right give ground on this and just say, yeah, you know what, we'll cover those sales just so you'll stop talking about it?
Well, I think yes and no. So on the one hand, you are right. These publicly advertised private sales, we know that this is not a major way in which criminals are getting their guns. It's certainly not a way in which would-be mass shooters are getting their guns. In fact, I'm only aware of one mass shooting in recent history that might, and that's the key word, might have been prevented or at least delayed because it went through a private sale and the person may have been prohibited. But other than that, largely people who are already prohibited are getting their guns from black market sales. When they are going through gun stores, it's because they can pass a background check, presumably. So this isn't, again, really addressing ways that criminals get their guns. Now, there is this argument that says, well, this is a way that they could plausibly get their guns. It perhaps makes sense to look at addressing it. And I think the only way that that argument makes sense is if it's done in a way that doesn't go beyond that it doesn't, for example, punish other types of low-risk sales. And that also, within this, there's room for talking about, do we exempt concealed carry permit holders? Or in states like Illinois, where you need a permit to just own a gun. Presumably, by definition, if you have that permit, you're a law-abiding citizen. You pass a background check. So I think there's ways of, give and take within that limited parameter, again, of publicly advertised private sales to strangers. But as soon as we start getting beyond that and increasing burdens beyond the sort of, recognition that it's a low reward endeavor, you're right in suggesting that at a certain point it stops being worth even having that conversation if the other side isn't willing to have it as well.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.